Hello, my name is Jeffrey Nicholas. I'm an associate professor of philosophy at Providence College. This is the penultimate or second to last lecture in this series of lectures on Alasdair MacIntyre's Dependent Rational Animals. In this lecture, we are considering the last chapter of the book, Chapter 13, Moral Commitment and Rational Inquiry. And in the final lecture, I will give her an overview analysis of the strengths and weaknesses of MacIntyre's thought within this text itself. So just to remind us where we have been, MacIntyre goes over the argument that he has laid out in the previous 12 chapters, right? So we share some features with non-human animals, not only reasons for actions, but our initial rationality is a pre-linguistic rationality. So as infants and children, we have this sort of pre-linguistic reasons for acting and pre-linguistic beliefs that we have for acting that we develop as we mature from childhood to adult. We are also vulnerable creatures who depend on others at various stages and sometimes throughout our entire lives. And that is not only a physical vulnerability, but also a mental and a moral vulnerability, right? In which we have to learn from others and depend upon others to help us to learn how to evaluate and stand back from our desires and reasons. Flourishing then requires certain kinds of qualities of characters, right? What we call the virtues that support the relationships in which we receive from others and give to others what is needed, right? So if we're vulnerable creatures, we're involved in these relationships of receiving and giving in which we support each other throughout various stages in our lives. And that is part of what it means to flourish as a particular kind of animals that we are, human animals, Homo sapiens. And so the political communities that we develop, if they are going to support our flourishing, must be centered on common goods, that those goods that arise out of our shared deliberation with each other, using a shared language, which require commitments that are in some ways unconditional, right? So we have to be committed to the people in our community through just generosity and through misericordia. And sometimes that expands the boundaries of our community, expands the boundaries of our commitment. But it is only within those unconditional commitments that we can flourish through those relationships of receiving and giving as vulnerable creatures to develop our capacities for reasoning. So, is there any kind of problem that we have to sort of understand through this argument that challenges our capacities for that shared understanding? Well, one of the challenges that we saw in the last chapter was that we seem to be committed to this community and to this shared language in ways that might make it seem like we are prisoners to that community and shared language. And so what MacIntyre is going to try to articulate is why that is not actually a problem, and why we are not prisoners, so to speak, but rather why we are outside of the prison trying to articulate what it means to be free. Because the idea that we are prisoners rests on the notion that reason is an individual experience, that rationality is an individual affair, an individual power. And yet the argument of the last 12 chapters has shown us that in fact that's not true, right? That rational inquiry, rational deliberation is a shared mode of practice. It requires us to be in dialogue with others, not only to help us to understand who we are and how to separate ourselves from our present desires, right? But in terms of articulating the reasons for and against what it means to desire this or that, and what it means to develop to desire the certain things that we as particular individuals desire. So I've come back again and again to various practices in which we learn these or develop these capacities that we have. So if we're thinking about theater as a practice, it is only within that shared mode of understanding what it means to give up our desires, right? And understand how to step back from them and evaluate them, that we are able to articulate better desires that help us to flourish as particular individuals. So if I desire to play this character because that's the person who is you're going to be on the stage most, then I failed to understand what it is that I do as an actor, right? And so what is necessary for me to really make that person live on the stage as the center character is to replace my desires with the desires of that character within this play, right? And so there are particular reasons for doing that. But I cannot do that if I just try to understand myself. This is a shared practice and a shared set of reasons. And so this is why local communities of giving and receiving are important, and why they have, of course, faced periodic questioning and communal debate. And when they are unable to resolve, right, those questionings and those communal debates, they simply die away and disappear. And so the present form of any local community today is one that has resulted from previous forums that have undergone the question. So we don't have to worry about being prisoners, because what we do is we create our freedom through that shared dialogue. Are there limits to this questioning? Of course, just generosity means that we have to be able to respond to those who are in dire need. And that means that I have to be able to act in ways that are the right things to do, right? And which do not require me to think at every moment about flourishing at this particular level, right? So I've given the example of waking up to the alarm and doing certain things. And MacIntyre wants to make the same sort of argument. If I see someone who is in desperate need, someone has fallen on the street and broken a leg, and I just walk on by and I don't help that person, then I have not responded accordingly. So there is certain limitations to what is required with maintaining these communities of giving and receiving, right? But when I give to that person, when I stop and respond to that person as a person who has fallen, I'm not thinking about how that reflects on my flourishing. I'm responding immediately to the need. So part of what we've looked at throughout this series is that what we're doing is developing the affect that we need to respond in ways that support the flourishing of the community, right? And so part of what I'm learning within that situation is that virtues sometimes do not require the justificatory reasoning that we would expect from the philosophical argument that we're giving, right? Sometimes virtue is its own justification. So what happens then is that within these communities of giving and receiving, education transforms us, right? So in learning to become an actor, my passions and inclinations are transformed. In learning to become a baseball player, my passions and inclinations are transformed, right? So that I develop new passions and new inclinations, so that I develop as a fully flourishing person, right? And so even though this happens within the confines of the community, it's the particularity of the person that is the subject, right? The person who has to transform so that he or she becomes the person that he or she could be, right? So we have to recognize the other as a particular person, right? Not everyone is going to, let me rephrase that. The individual person is going to be a unique person who has unique history, unique desires, which we respond to as that unique person, even as we are referring to the common goods that we share together, right? And so deliberation requires a commitment to the particularity of this person, not to the community as an abstract, and not to the person as an abstract thing. Now, MacIntyre challenges Friedrich Nietzsche here as the counterpoint to his argument. And this is actually common throughout much of MacIntyre's argument. Nietzsche is an antagonist within After Virtue, one of the books that we talked about at the beginning. And he's also an antagonist, although much less so in MacIntyre's latest book, Ethics and the Conflicts of Modernity. Because what MacIntyre sees Nietzsche as doing is trying to separate himself from all relationships of giving and receiving, right? And so he defines animals as predators and prey and ignores the way that particular animals might work as social animals. So might ignore the fact of dolphins as social animals who live in this sort of social context and only sees them as predators hunting down tuna that they eat, right? And tuna, of course, are just prey. And so this changes the way, for Nietzsche, how we should think about the individual. The individual is someone who tries to find power over others so that even if he sees himself as prey, he convinces himself that he can become the predator and change the way and protect himself as a member of those who are preyed upon. And so in this situation, friends are not people who support us in developing our powers, but they are rather our greatest enemies. It's through that challenge that we become who we are by testing ourselves against the will of others, right? So there's this sort of conflict that is never to be reconciled, because it's through the conflict that we develop what we are as particular individuals, and it's not through these relationships of giving and receiving. So that rational justification is never a result of shared deliberation, but it is a result of my will to power. In other words, rational deliberation, everything that MacIntyre has talked about, Nietzsche would see as an attempt to impose a particular view on the world so that MacIntyre now, and me as I'm giving this lecture, have power over others because we are exercising our deliberative capacity to make sure that you as an individual cannot overweigh what I want. So now you become the prey and we have become the predator. And of course, the problem here is that you simply cannot respond to Nietzsche, right? Because since he doesn't share a commitment to rational deliberation, the kind of commitment that we do, he's not going to accept the result of that rational deliberation. In fact, he's never going to participate because he doesn't see rational deliberation as a means of coming to a common mind where we all express our individuality and our freedom together. And yet you cannot reply to Nietzsche on his own terms, because every such reply is itself an expression of power, right? And so everything becomes this combat of forces, combat of power, and never an attempt to realize freedom, that is to realize our flourishing as independent practical reasoners within these conditions of giving and receiving. And the fact that we cannot reply to Nietzsche makes his challenge the greatest challenge within the modern world to the Aristotelian philosophy that MacIntyre has tried to articulate. And so many people who have just heard me talk about Nietzsche might just say, well, that's right? Everything is just an expression of power. And once they have done that, then they've removed themselves from being able to deliberate with us about what it is that we share in common. And so they've made it impossible to be part of this community in which we articulate our shared common mind, right? And that becomes a sadness for us, right? Because we have lost a member of our community. What MacIntyre wants to do is to argue that for the common good, it is a common good to the very young, to the very old, as well to the mature adult, and to the paraplegic, and to the mentally backward, as well as to the athlete, and to those engaged in intellectual inquiry, a good that has regard to every vulnerability to which our initial animal identity and our animal nature, as well as our specifically human condition, exposes us. Practical reason, shared deliberation, is the good it is because and insofar as rational inquiry serves and partly constitutes that common good that it is itself, the good that it is, right? So the kind of common good that MacIntyre, this is a long worded sentence, and MacIntyre has quite a few of those. The kind of good that he's articulating is the good that it is because it responds to all these different features of the human condition in a way that Nietzsche's cannot, because it isn't seen as a good in the same way, right? And so it's only in living out this common good that we are able to respond to those who only seek power.